maybe you have some additional subject we can talk about SSMS and Azure Data Studio before we wait until 11:30.
We can do that. We can do that. If anybody has questions, so I assume that people are putting questions in the chat. So if anybody has questions right now about SSMS or Azure Data Studio, feel free to let me know. It may seem, I think, to some folks that those tools are competitors. And that's a question that I've gotten a lot, right? What am I supposed to use? Am I supposed to use SSMS or am I supposed to use Azure Data Studio? And the answer really is both. Because for those of us who have been around for a long time, who've worked with SQL Server for a long time, Management Studio is what we live in. And today's demos will be in Management Studio. But there is absolutely a case for times when you need to use, everything today is in SSMS. It's still early. But there are absolutely times when you may need to use Azure Data Studio. And there are some things that exist in each tool that don't exist in the other. So I think that it's fair to expect that over time you might start to use Azure Data Studio a little bit more. We recognize that there are definitely some gaps within Azure Data Studio. There are things that exist in SSMS that aren't there. And if you think about SSMS, it's been around for 17 years, right? That came out with SQL Server 2005. So this is a tool that's been around a long time and is everything for people. But for somebody who's new to SQL or new to Azure and doesn't need everything that's in SSMS, it's overwhelming the first time they go in there, because if you've been in SSMS for a long time, you don't even notice it anymore. But when you go in, right, there's all of this stuff within an Object Explorer that folks don't need. So Azure Data Studio is a little bit less. And then if there's things that you do need, like agent jobs, right, then you can add the extension to bring that in. So that's one of the big values of Azure Data Studio, is that it's extensible, right? You can just add in things that you need. And otherwise, it's a nice, clean, modern looking tool that allows you to do some of the basic things that you need to do against a database. So I think there's a lot of confusion out there about those two tools. So one of my goals is to try to clarify that over the next months and such.
And will they evolve together, or we are looking to a future when Data Studio may overcome the SSMS?
Well, it's a really good question, because the thing is that we see when we look at telemetry, when we look at the data, and when we talk to some users, there's more and more folks who are using Mac, right? Who are using Mac OS, and some small faction that use Linux. And for those folks, they can't run SSMS, right? If you're on a Mac and you want to work with SQL Server, you either have to go to another machine, right? You have to RDP, jump over to another machine and use that, or spin up a VM, install Windows on it, and then use Management Studio. And for some folks, they don't want to do that. They're quite happy to use Azure Data Studio. And over time, we continue to see more and more people who are using Mac OS as example. And the Windows market share actually is going down a little bit. And so there is an importance, I think, in adding functionality over to Azure Data Studio. And then I think your question is, like, let's say that there's something new that you need to put into a tool. Where do you put it? And I think right now, I would say we'll probably start to move some things over to Azure Data Studio, like a migration, for example. Right, we have an extension now for migrating to Azure SQL, which is in Azure Data Studio. You don't do that from SSMS. You do that from Azure Data Studio, and that the engineers who've worked on that like continue to evolve that extension. So. SSMS isn't going away anytime soon, but at the same time, SSMS is not a modern looking tool, and there's a lot of newer folks that think it looks old and clunky. And while we're hoping in our next release, so not in SSMS 19, but in the one after that, which would be SSMS 20, we are hoping to get to 64-bit, making SSMS work on a Mac OS or Linux, like that isn't our team, right? Because this lives on the Visual Studio shell. So for as long as you see Visual Studio running on Windows and not on any other platform, SSMS can only run on Windows. And I don't know that that's really going to make sense 5-10 years down the road.
That's great. That's great. And one feature that I miss on SSMS are the notebooks.
Yeah.
Is there any plan for that, or they will continue on only Azure Data Studio?
They will only be in Azure Data Studio. There are absolutely
Only.
no plans to bring notebooks to Management Studio.
Okay, great.